Good morning, everyone. My name's Jennifer Bunty. I work for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. Our webinar today is about burn prioritization mapping, calling it Getting Fire on the Ground in the Right Places. And our host today is Joe Lemeris. Joe's the senior biologist for SC State Parks. He's charged with heading up habitat restoration initiatives and monitoring efforts across the state. Joe has a strong interest and background in using geospatial analyses to better prioritize and more effectively make decisions about restoring and protecting landscapes. Before starting with the state of South Carolina, Joe headed up National Geographic's Big Cats Initiative assessment team, which focuses efforts to use geospatial tools to assist conservation programs across big cat ranges around the world. He's now applying these modeling skills and tools within SC State Parks, as well as across partner organizations like the Fire Learning Network. And with that, Joe, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks everybody for joining in today. Like Jen mentioned, my name is Joe Lemeris. I'm Senior Biologist with South Carolina State Parks. And I'm here to sort of go over a few of the analyses that I recently performed as a part of the Nature Conservancy's Fire Learning Network, specifically within the Southern Blue Ridge Escarpment landscape. For those of you who are unaware, Fire Learning Network is a nationwide sort of network of partners broken down into different landscapes across the region. And the section that South Carolina touches is part of the Southern Blue Ridge landscape, which goes from the Appalachians of Virginia down to Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, etc. And as you can see from the map here, our landscape is sort of along the Blue Ridge Escarpment, which borders North Carolina and South Carolina. Just for reference, the properties that I manage, natural resource management activities, are circled in red here. We are a relatively small land management agency across the landscape. We only have about 16,000 acres managed by our agency within this landscape, which is, I think, only about 2% or so of the 765,000 acre landscape. But we are just as it's a little bit different than some landscapes in that we are not really dominated by a single agency. The U.S. Forest Service does have a big chunk of land here, but as you can see from all the different colors of the managing agencies and organizations, it really has to be sort of an all lands approach, a network of partners working together to sort of bring fire back to the landscape. And to help do that, I've sort of offered my assistance in heading up some of these preliminary modeling efforts for sort of prioritizing where fire really should be focused on the ground within this landscape. Burn prioritization really isn't a new idea. I do not suggest that I came up with any of these models myself. I typically like to take good ideas from other people and use them for my own benefit, really, and others as well, and then tweak certain things to be able to make it fit our situation. But usually prioritization across, when we're talking about burning, people really historically have been prioritizing by how much acreage they can burn, getting the most acreage for their dollar, creating easy burn units, convenient to burn with limited resources, using existing fire breaks like roads or minimal fire breaks across the path of least resistance, for example. Of course, human safety is always something to consider when you do prioritize these burns, including areas of significant wildland-urban interface risk, areas that are backed up against subdivisions or other types of human development. And oftentimes these areas are the areas that really should be burned more often than not, but because of the risk of humans, it may not be as easy to do. So this method of burn prioritization that we're exploring here incorporates a little bit more of the ecologically important attributes across the landscape. We try to include variables like to include current fire adapted landscapes, areas where were historically fire adapted but have since departed from that regime due to fire suppression. Fine-scale ecozone data sets are a way to do this, and I'll get a little more into that in a few minutes. And though many of these easy units can be compatible with ecologically important units, we think it is important to include these so that we look at the landscape from not just sort of an operationally feasible standpoint, but also an ecologically feasible and an important standpoint. So I was mentioning about ecozone data. The Southern Blue Ridge Escarpment landscape recently had its entire focal area analyzed for ecozones, and this was headed by Steve Simone, who's retired from U.S. Forest Service, and basically they went around to various sample sites across this landscape and tried to figure out sort of what the habitat would have been prior to fire suppression, essentially. And that's what all of these colors here represent. I'll try and get the legend up here now. So if any of you are familiar with South Carolina, this is Lake Jocassee and the land surrounding it. You can see, based on this viewer, that these landscapes are made up of quite a few different habitats, many of which are historically fire adapted. That sort of pale green color is shortleaf pine oak forest and woodland, pine oak heath woodland as well. And each of these different habitats have different sort of regimes that fire would have entered into. For example, shortleaf pine oak forest woodland would have entered naturally in a lot more of a frequently, maybe every 3 to 5 to 7 years, rather than some of these other co-forest systems that wouldn't see fire for decades, for example. But the point to remember here is that many of these landscapes have been historically dependent on fire in some level, and a lot of these areas have not seen fire in some time. So this data set of what we think the landscape would have been based on sort of these clues on the ground is very important when trying to prioritize where you want to reintroduce fire. Let's get back to the PowerPoint. And as I said, this was not a new idea for me. I got this methodology. It sort of started off of an idea that Josh Kelly from Mountain True presented at a Fire Learning Network workshop a couple years back. He has done similar prioritization modeling for the FLN network that runs along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. And specifically, he did this prioritization for the Cherokee National Forest, the north zone of that. And other FLN groups have looked at prioritization in this way on varying scales, but this is the one that I sort of modeled mine after the most. Basically, what Josh and his team did was that they used similar ecozone data, like the one that was developed for the Southern Blue Ridge Escarpment landscape, on their properties, the National Forest properties, and looked at sort of where on the property has yellow pine ecozones, dry oak forest ecozones, dry music oak forest ecozones, and montane oak forest ecozones. Each of these different ecozones have varying levels of of fire dependency, inputting those into a model, and then also incorporating things like regeneration from fire. Where are we seeing that wildfire history across the property? Where existing shortleaf pine stands are currently, as well as fire-adapted, rare, threatened, and endangered species, both plant and animal, and then also wildfire or rare fire communities that exist across the landscape, and giving each of these different variables a certain level of importance. And of course, this is where models sort of take different different roads depending on the user. The level of importance of one variable may be lower or higher to me than, say, somebody else who wants to try and do this on their property. So that's kind of why I wouldn't say that my method is exactly like the EcoMath model that Mountain True developed, but it is very, very similar. I mean, it pulls a lot of the same variables, and so we'll try and look at that as well. And the output, I should mention, of all these different variables combined is a relative importance score, which is kind of what you see on this map here across whichever property you're looking at. In this case here on the Cherokee, it was based on 1 kilometer grid cells, just to sort of give a more representative look at where on the landscape more fire should be prioritized. And it looks more, it gives it a less objective way of looking at it with this 1 kilometer grid cell, rather than looking at it from, say, a property parcel data scale, for example. So I really liked how the output looked on this particular model, and you can kind of see from the map there that a lot of the areas that have higher importance, which are shown in red, are actually at lower elevations on the Cherokee National Forest, whereas the higher elevations are lower priority. And that makes sense because the communities and ecosystems that would have historically been at lower elevations are more fire dependent, see fire more frequently. So this is sort of an intuitive map. It makes more sense, and it sort of shows where along the property, maybe more efforts could be put into really trying to get more fire on the ground. So I really like that. Like I said, I decided to try and do this for our whole region as well, and then see how it would look if I broke it down on one of our properties, for example. And the hope with this is to, allow more of our land managers throughout the landscape to be able to use this type of prioritization, one, on their own property, but also to see if there are any areas that may be a high priority but are across partner boundaries. And we'll look at that in a little bit. So with this slide here, this is sort of my kind of box and arrow diagram of how my model ended up looking. So I ended up putting 5 different variables, each weighted slightly differently depending on the level of importance that I thought was necessary, and combined those into a weighted model output. And those were ranked ecozone data, specifically the fire-adapted regimes. I weighted that at a 30% of the model, so the output would take that most into account when determining where fire should be prioritized. I also used Nature Conservancy's landscape resiliency data and ranked that fairly high as well. It shows, sort of a general output of how resilient a unit of land is, in the face of various aspects of climate change, increased droughts versus ice storms, things like that. And prescribed fire and regular low intensity fire is a way of making landscapes more resilient to some of these more severe events, also like wildfire. So I thought that was important to include here. I also included a wildfire density map that I pulled from the SouthRAP website, the wildfire risk assessment tool that was developed across the southeastern states. And that is a publicly available website as well. Then I also included estimated basal area of shortleaf pine based on data pulled from the Shortleaf Initiative, which I believe was FIA data in some respect through the U.S. Forest Service. And finally, I included a fire-adapted rare, threatened, and endangered species variable, which I got the data from North Carolina and South Carolina, each of their respective natural heritage trust data sources. And I used that as well as the shortleaf pine area to be sort of lower ranking, mainly because, while rare, threatened, and endangered species are very important to the landscape and they should be protected, they really shouldn't dominate the decision making on if we're talking about landscape scale restoration. You may only have, say, for example, the mountain sweet pitcher plant in a couple areas on your property, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those areas should be burned all the time first. For example, if there's a better window to do another bigger block that sees fire just as frequently, if not more, then that landscape level data should be taken into account as well. So while it's important, we did feel the need to include it. We just wanted to rank it a little bit lower than some of the other landscape level variables. So the output for this, skipped ahead of myself here. So this is just one method. It's important to remember, as I mentioned before, that this is a weighted model based on what myself and a few other stakeholders decided were important variables to include. And there certainly could be improvements to this. There could be variables that we want to incorporate as well. We can have as many variables as we really want. I wanted to keep it simple as a first go of it, because what often happens is if you add all these variables, often some of them are very redundant, and some of the variables would actually explain these more finite specific ones just as well. So this is where I started with, but I'm definitely open to interpretation. It's actually this is one of those webinars where if you the viewers have any suggestions, we'd love to hear them. Of course, there is no one size fits all approach, I believe, for especially if you're not in this particular region of North and South Carolina. There are different ecological aspects to consider. And I did want to mention before I showed the output that I received that ecological departure analysis is another component of this ecozone data that I think would help. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, ecological departure analysis is basically looking at how much a particular landscape has changed from its ideal condition, which in our view is intact fire regime. So, based on the ecozone data, which would be our ideal conditions of a landscape, that is compared with current conditions, and the departure is how much that differs from one another. So there are data sets. Landfire has a data set that can definitely get us started to look at this aspect. I did not include it in this particular model because it is a little bit coarser of an analysis. It's 30 by 30 meter. 30 by 30 meters is the smallest resolution you can get, and it's a little bit rough as far as sort of really digging down into a property level analysis. Basically, all of the the different landscape types are over 50% departed, which is important to consider. But this is the map of sort of how our model ended up producing based on the 5 variables that are shown here again, in those different ranks. So you can see anything that's sort of in the orangey red is greater than 50%, as far as the weightings are concerned. Those would be higher prioritization areas, and anything sort of yellow down to blue would be less than 50%. And this kind of follows with what Josh Kelly and his team's ecomath analysis looked like as well. You can kind of tell that up in on the escarpment, above the escarpment, higher elevations, you see those are a little bit lower prioritization based on the habitats that exist up there. And then down in the South Carolina below the escarpment is a little bit higher prioritization. So that's sort of the raw output that shows based on your 30 by 30 or 10 by 10 foot resolution is. But if you want to really dig down and see, okay, well, based on the entire landscape, what part of the landscape should I focus on first? The landscape is huge. Where am I going to focus my resources? So I split them out into different ways, and this is a good this analysis can be broken down and looked at from a variety of different scales. We've got based on watersheds on the left-hand side here. That's looking at the prioritization based on each watershed that's in the FLN landscape, and it still sort of focuses. You can see focuses us on where the most important areas would be if we had the resources available to incorporate fire. And then I broke that down similar to how Josh did his in Ecomath 2.0 with grid cells. My grids, I think, are a little bit bigger than his, but it still gets the same sort of point across. You can see across the landscape where the greatest priority areas are in this landscape for reintroducing fire and continuing burning. You can drill this down even further if you like, based on a property level. I decided to do this for one of our properties, Table Rock State Park in Pickens County, South Carolina. So this is sort of just a subset of that. On the right, you can see the raw data that shows sort of the anywhere red and orange is above 50% priority. Anything that's sort of yellow and blue is below. And on the left there shows the whole property with a larger grid scale. So you can kind of see that these areas sort of line up as well. The intense wildfire season this past year. South Carolina was lucky in that the biggest wildfire that we had did not have any structural or life loss or anything like that, but it was the biggest wildfire in South Carolina, recorded wildfire in South Carolina's history, at 10,600 acres. There will be certainly probably some delayed mortality of many of the trees in the forest, but vast majority of the forest floor, the duff was not consumed very much. Total fuel consumption, but not a whole lot of duff consumption. So it's interesting to see that it actually behaved quite nicely for a wildfire in that respect. But I just wanted to highlight that within this wildfire, for anyone, if you're talking to folks that may still be skeptical about those benefits to the landscape that fire can have, this is potentially a way to sort of show them that these areas actually do have histories of being burned, and while some of many of these areas are low priority, 2/3 of the burned area at the Pinnacle Mountain wildfire were actually, considered, at least according to this model, to be moderate to high priority for burn prioritization. So in that respect, it will, eventually do it'll be a net positive, I think, to the forest as far as ecosystem health is concerned. And just because 34% of the property is low priority, according to this model, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be burned. It just means that they probably shouldn't be burned as much. Wildfire would not have been seen on those areas for decades, or in some cases, many, many decades. But since, at least on Table Rock, I don't necessarily, I can't speak for some of the other property owners where this was affected, but on Table Rock, there hasn't been an intentional fire set of any magnitude on Table Rock for close to a century. And so some of these areas that are lower prioritization, it probably was time for them to see some fire. So this is just one way to use this data to kind of interpret both prescribed burning, controlled burning, as well as natural events, wildfire, things like that. So with that, we can open it up for discussion or questions. That's the end of my formal talk. I'd love to hear from anybody about what other variables would make sense or be important to landowners to include or exclude from this type of prioritization model. Considering the data availability as well. Is there a one-size-fits-all approach, or is it one of those things where each landowner is going to have to figure out what's important to them as far as returning fire to the landscape and redo an analysis using different methods? And how might landowners or managers use this information to increase their burning efficiency? These are all important questions, and even if we don't hit on all of them today, it's certainly something to think about, and I'd be happy to discuss with anyone afterwards. So with that, I think I can follow. Let's see, there's a couple questions here. The question written here is the landscape resiliency data shareable outside of TNC? It is. We do have one of the website that I used actually to scroll around. Let's see if I can get back here. We can provide a link, I believe, as a follow-up to this, and absolutely, you certainly can. I ran the model, based on just using the whole data set, and the way it's set up is all you really have to do is essentially change the percent of importance that you would require. So let me see if I can get that back. So with this particular here with our 5 variables, if we wanted to stick, say that the National Forest wanted to stick with these 5 variables, but decided that they wanted to have more importance for landscape resiliency, all we have to do is just tweak the percentages and rerun the model, and it'll spit out a different result. And that can be done. You can use any boundary you like as far as how much of an extent you want this model to be run. So yeah, it is pretty applicable across really any parcel, any property, any burn unit. It actually might be more beneficial to individual landowners on the scale of burn units, to be able to plan for different burn units and figure out which parts of your property need more attention than others. But the ecozone data is really the delimiting factor in a lot of cases. If you are not within a landscape that has had ecozone data collected, then that would be the first step in trying to get this done, is figuring out how to acquire some of that data. So.
All right. Well, while we wait a couple more minutes to see if anyone else has questions, I'd just like to mention that We are recording this webinar, and the recording will be available on the CAFM's website, so www.appalachianfire.org. I just put the website there in the chat box, so please feel free to visit that. We'll have this up and other resources and other recordings of our webinars available there as well.
Great. Question just came in: is the ecozone data available outside of this FLN? There are several FLN groups that have had this ecozone data performed. The Cherokee Foothills landscape that I mentioned with Cherokee National Forest, they have that data set as well. I do not know off the top of my head what other groups have had it done, but I feel like there was a strong push to get them done several years back, and so chances might be good, but I would check with whoever your local FLN group, or if you're not within a local FLN group, it might be there may be universities that have performed this. The national forests typically try to do some, but I'm not aware of a single sort of location or source for the data that's outside of an FLN specifically. Another question came in: how long does it take to complete the full analysis if starting in an area outside of the FLN, for example, in longleaf pine coastal areas? That's a good question. I feel like when this FLN group had it performed, I actually had not started on at state parks yet when this analysis was being completed, so I can't say for sure, but I feel like it was contracted out to Steve Simone, and it took them at least 1 or 2 field seasons. I could be wrong, but I feel like that's how long it took. They had to select quite a few different sort of survey points across the landscape, visit those, and perform a pretty in-depth inventory and analysis there. And this actually, I should mention, the most recent iteration that we used was actually the 4th time that they had sort of revamped or improved the data set. No model is perfect, of course. There's inaccuracies, and even with this one, there's a level of inaccuracy. Certain areas may not be exactly the right habitat that the model predicts, but it's very close. It's the best representation that we've got. As far as longleaf coastal ecosystems are concerned, yeah, I'm not sure about what the data. I don't know if the data sets exist in South Carolina. There may be for other ecosystems, but there are several currently existing sort of longleaf suitability tools out there. I think that North Carolina Forest Service has one, but that's more geared towards sort of suitability for planting longleaf rather than where longleaf may have existed in the past. So, but I'm getting long-winded again. I'm sorry. Yeah, just as far as the question is concerned, I'm not really sure how long it would take if this type of analysis were to be done in those ecosystems. Great.
And Jennifer, if you aren't in contact with with the Southern Fire Exchange, that might be a good resource for you as well. There's 15 consortia like the Appalachian Consortium across the country that that serve a function of gathering data and collaborating with other groups, and they might be able to steer you in the right direction if you're looking for data or looking for research projects.
Yes, absolutely. I forgot to mention that Southern Fire Exchange definitely is a good resource, and they would be able to point you in the right direction for sure.
All right. Well, unless we have any last-minute questions, Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Joe, for presenting
Thank
today.
you. Happy to be here.